So if you look at the words for that song, a lot of people think of it more of it being an Easter song, right? But what was the song really about? What is he talking about? And how does it relate to the resurrection in this class, as we talk about it?
It's our future resurrection.
It's our future resurrection he's pointing to, right? And I think that is one of the important aspects of understanding why the resurrection is so important for the Christian. Not only is it because Paul says, hey, if the resurrection is not true, then Christianity is not true, meaning that we're falsifiable, but also that there is a future hope. That's what Christianity is about, that future hope, that restoration of the way things are meant to be. And if you think about it, and you look at a lot of people's desires and the fact that atheists even know right from wrong, and they will argue very vehemently that they can be good people. But that begs the question, how do they know what good is? It's because they know, we all know, God's put that in our hearts, the way things ought to be. And we know that things aren't the way they ought to be. That's a part of the fall. That's the situation we find ourselves in. And the resurrection is that promise and proof that in the future that's going to be rectified, right? And so that's why Easter Sunday is more than just Jesus being resurrected. That is evidence and proof of what is to come for us. That restoration that we all long for and want. So why is it critical? One of the things is because it's falsifiable, like I said, Paul says, hey, if it didn't happen, then Christianity is false and you shouldn't believe it. In fact, you should be pitied of all men. Pretty harsh words. Actually, if you read Paul, he's kind of harsh sometimes. But he's trying to make the point that, hey, this is vitally important. In fact, so what's he saying? If you go to 1 Corinthians 15:12 through 17, he says, now if Christ had been preached that he rose from the dead, now how say some among you that there is no resurrection of the dead? And he's talking about the resurrection of all of us, right? How do you say that that's not true if Jesus did it? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ is not risen. So if nobody can rise from the dead, then Jesus Christ didn't rise from it. And if Christ is not risen, then our preaching is vain, and your faith is also in vain. Yes, and we are found false witnesses of God, because we have testified of God that he has raised up Christ, from who he raised not up. So he's saying, if we're liars, basically, if we say he is and he hasn't been. If that be so, the dead is not risen. For if the dead raise not, then it is not Christ raised. And if Christ be not raised, your faith is in vain. You are yet in your sins. So basically he's saying, if Jesus Christ never rose from the dead, then you're still in your sins, so what's the point? Then what kind of gospel do we actually have? There is no rectification of the problem that man finds itself in, the problem of sin. So this is why it's really, sorry for the King James Version, but because I record these things so that you guys can go back and watch them later, and there's strict rules about how much you can quote of one thing in a thing. Yes?
What's really great in the 150 pages of the resurrection of the Son of God is that he shows that the whole Greco-Roman world thought notions of the resurrection of the body were absolutely insane. So all the Christians had to do was face an entire civilization which had been molded after Plato, Philo, Heraclitus, followers of Heraclitus, and they just thought that the dumbest thing you could do was let this body die and then bring it back to life, because the body was such an ugly and repulsive thing. Now, I've seen some of those bodies, not my own. While they were still living, they were rather repulsive. But and there is that fact that I don't go by the large plate glass windows anymore. That's offensive when I look in them and see the reflection. But the Greeks philosophically held that the body was a prison for the soul. So when the Christians hit the road with the gospel of Christ, they had this gigantic problem, and it's centered around the resurrection. And not only that, Paul seems to be addressing the residual, not the Pharisees, but the Sadducees who did not believe in the resurrection. So there was, almost a hopeless task before the church to convince the folks that there was a resurrection of the body, and this was indeed the gospel.
Yes, and this is still today. Don points out perfectly that there is this concept of the spiritual versus the physical. And even in the church today, there tends to be a focus on just the spiritual, as if it's better somehow than the physical. But how are we intended to live? Right? If you think about that, how are we intended? If you go back to the book of Genesis, how are we intended to live? We were intended to be in a body, caring for this planet, this earth, the garden, however you want to put it. So we had work. There's a good example for the fact that when you get to heaven, there'll probably be work, but it'll be satisfying work. That we are meant to be stewards of nature. So there's a lot of things. Yeah. Well, hopefully not. Right. But here's the thing that you look at. It focused on being a spiritual and physical thing. We're a holistic religion, and sometimes we try to over-focus on the spiritual. A good example of this is in missions that kind of fail sometimes, where just go there and preach the gospel. That's all you need to do. Well, the problem is they're a holistic being, and the Bible looks at us as holistic beings. We're physical and spiritual. We need to help take care of their needs as well. Their need for food, medical care, all that kind of stuff. When we go in and show Christ's love by taking care of their physical needs, then they're receptive to hear the gospel, right? And so you'll see some of the short-term mission trips around here, like I know Kevin Ackerman, he goes to Chad and does dentistry work, right? So he goes there and takes care of the physical needs and stuff like that. That is vitally important, because we can't look at a person and say, oh, we're only concerned about your spiritual because the physical's all bad. The Gnostics back at the time when he was talking about also looked at it that way. The body was bad, the physical was bad. That's why you get a lot of the Gnostics that say Jesus was never even a physical being, right? He was only a spiritual being, because if he was physical, physical's considered evil. But that's not the Christian concept. The Christian concept is we're a holistic being, part spiritual, part physical. And when we talk about the resurrection, we talk about coming back to reuniting the physical and the spiritual, both being perfected rather than tarnished as we are now. I know the only way that we understand things is we understand how our bodies fail us as we get older. We understand how our longings and desires aren't always for the Lord and what's good and right, because we have our spirit and our physical body are suffering under sin. But the fact that we know that things aren't the way they ought to be says that there is a way that it should be. So we all recognize that. And that's what, when we talk to other people about the resurrection, maybe we want to focus in on that, because then we're focusing in on what their hearts desire. I mean, if you think about it, a lot of naturalists, let's take pagans for instance, they revere nature very much, very highly, to the point that they deify it. But what they're recognizing is that nature is good. The physical part of nature is good. They recognize that. They take it too far. For us, that's a great opportunity for us to build a bridge between like someone who's a pagan or a Wiccan or something like that, and say, God created this creation, and it is good, and it's here for our benefit, and we are supposed to take care of it. But we don't deify it. We thank the Creator for it. Right? And that gives you the opportunity to then have a discussion with somebody of that faith. Because now you can talk about that. Now we can start talking about the resurrection, because you can kind of see how this fits in with that as well. So I think the resurrection is probably one of the most useful aspects in Christian theology, because it's the pivotal point, but it's the one that kind of permeates all these other points. And when we look at missions, taking care of the physical aspects and the spiritual aspects, not just leaving one to the detriment of the other. Our world is very much split down the middle. There are people that are very much about the physical. A lot of them overemphasize the value of science. And then you have the other people, and I'm sure you've heard this before, who look more towards the what Francis Schaeffer would have called the upper story, which you could roughly say is the spiritual aspect. That's the people that say, well, that's true for you, but not for me, or that's about your feelings, and I feel this way, and everything is subjective because it's not concrete, because there's no physical stuff to concrete it with. And so you end up with, in this even society where there is this dichotomy and this bifurcation, splitting the person either. If you talk to an atheist, most of them are probably what we would call materialists, and that means that they believe that only the physical is what exists. There is nothing spiritual. And so when it comes down to it, everything is nothing but a chemical reaction in your brain. That's how they look at it. So they're missing the spiritual aspect of it. So a lot of people don't go to atheism because they say, I know that there is something more than just my physical being. A big thing with the hippie movement that I think Francis Schaeffer wrote a lot about, and I think it's really good, and that is that he talked about a lot of them were taking psychedelic drugs to escape from reason to get to the spiritual, to get to that feeling, that emotional aspect. They wanted to feel the spiritual because they knew that there was something more than just the physicalness of us. And so when you look at the resurrection of Jesus, it's a holistic thing. Body and soul reunited, and a rectification of that tarnishing of both that comes into it. So the Christian worldview, and this is important to realize, is the one worldview that kind of takes the both halves and puts them together. The Gnostics denied the physical aspect. And we have people today like Eastern meditation and stuff like that overemphasize the spiritual to the detriment of the physical. In fact, I just read the story the other day. They found in an old Buddhist statue, when they did a X-ray of it or whatever, they found a monk who had been put into it when he was in meditation and sealed into it. So I don't know how that happened or why he did that, but there is definitely, to me, that is the epitome of denying the physical for the more spiritual aspects, right? Kind of a creepy thing, because I don't know how he just stayed there for long enough for them to put the mold around him and all that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting story. It'll be interesting to see why he got in there and how that all happened, but because I guess the story is that he was alive when it happened, but I don't know if that's the actual case. But so you'll.
That would be a guy who was really into it, right?
Yeah, he committed. A good example of being very committed. So when you look at these things, when you look at the world today, you can start to see these strains in the different ways that people think. And if you know what you're looking for, then you know how you can talk to them. Because the atheist is missing all those good things, right? The stuff that we know that there's something more there, right? They're missing, it's getting to the point where even they can't even explain from a physical point of view how mathematics works. There's no basis for it, right? Because it's immaterial. 1 + 1 = 2 does not exist. It's not a physical thing. It's a concept in your head, that's about it. So where does that come from, right? They have no answer for stuff like that. Anyways, so very important for us to remember there's two parts to it and holding it together. One of the things that we do anytime we look at anything in history, we should look at it, especially when you do any type of historical research. When historians say that that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, are they absolutely certain that he did? Or was it his troops that crossed and not him? Or did he go around? Right? Now the story says, from one source, that he did. Another source says he didn't. So how do you figure that out? Right? So anytime that you do any type of historical investigation, there's a part of it where you understand that you cannot have absolute certainty for historical evidence. That doesn't mean that we don't have some level of certainty. What will happen with it, especially with atheists, is they want it to be very black and white. They want you to hold to the fact that either you absolutely know that it happened, otherwise you can't say that it happened. Right? So they put the bar of evidence really high so that you can't reach it. So it stacks the deck before we even start. Now remember, they are going on the assumption that the Bible is not accurate, that God doesn't exist, and that there's only a material world. So what we want to ask them is say, hey, based upon the historical evidence, is it more or less likely that it happened, the resurrection happened? That's all that I want to get from an atheist. And I don't want them to assume that miracles can't happen, because that automatically assumes that God doesn't exist, right? Because if God exists, are miracles possible? And if God doesn't exist, are miracles possible? Actually, that one I can answer yes, too. If they know anything about quantum mechanics, all kinds of weird stuff can happen. It just doesn't happen very often. Anyways, so from this, if you look at this, I kind of make a scale here, and you can't really read it, but I'll read it for you here. It says absolute certainty, right? So like if you think of a 1 to 100%, and then you have virtual certainty, extremely likely, highly likely, likely, somewhere neutral, which it may or may not happen, and then unlikely, highly unlikely, extremely unlikely, virtually impossible, absolutely impossible, right? So when we take all of the evidence and we stack it all up, weigh it out with the evidence against and for, where do we fall on this spectrum? This is exactly the same thing they do in a court case, right? They don't absolutely know for a fact because nobody was there to witness the murder, right? Now, generally, when you talk about evidence from a court case, if it's a civil case, all you have to do is just get past neutral, right? 51% of evidence. So if it's 51% or greater, then as a juror, you're told to go ahead and say that the person's guilty. If it's something where it's dealing with, where you have to go beyond reasonable doubt, then it's going to be up here like extremely likely, right? So it has a higher level of evidence required because of the gravity of what we're talking about. But notice, nowhere do they ever get to absolute certainty, right? We can't function that way as human beings. We can't demand absolute certainty for everything that we know, otherwise we wouldn't know very much. And we have to act upon what we know and treat something as true or not. So when we talk to an atheist or a skeptic, all we want them to do really, I will make the case that we can get to extremely likely or virtually certain, somewhere in that range, just on the historical evidence, right? So I'm not even saying that we're just trying to get to 51%. I'm saying that if you add up all the evidence, it's much, much, much more likely than not likely. And so this just kind of gives you an idea. That's just the scale that I use. When I think of things, I look at it more like in the terms of probabilities and stuff like that, because it makes it a lot easier when you're talking to somebody of a different faith. What will end up happening is if a Christian comes in here, I'm absolutely certain that this happened. Well, that's great that is what you've committed to, because there's this last bit. If I feel that it's virtually certain that this happened, and that this little bit for me to take action and trust in, that's what we call faith. All right? So there's a concept of faith that a lot of Christians misunderstand. So to explain it is, faith doesn't mean there is no evidence and I believe this. That is not what the Bible talks about faith. In fact, the word is better translated trust in. So I have this evidence that gets me to extremely likely or virtually certain, and then I trust in that to take me to the next step, to treat it as if it's absolutely certain and live my life that way. So that would be the appropriate way to use faith in this context, that trust in what you already know. Now, obviously, you're going to know from other sources, because I'm just talking about historical evidence. I'm not talking about any spiritual evidence or anything that God's doing in your life that's pointing you in that direction as well. That's additional evidence that points in this direction, that it happened. I'm not discounting that. I'm saying that's just a little bit different. The problem that you have with this, and I think, Alan, you ran into this once before, it becomes very subjective, right? If a Mormon comes to your door and they say, I have felt a burning in my bosom that this is true, well, how do you test or verify that? Because Ellen could say, well, I felt a burning in my bosom that this is true. And they both don't agree. So whose burning's better? And who just has gas, right? Right, so how do we do that? So we have to have something outside of just this burning in the bosom. That is one of the reasons why I believe God gave us his word in a written form, so that we have something that we can test it. And the Bereans were credited for actually going back to the scripture and testing these things. So God definitely wants us to test things, and when we're like the Bereans, we do test things, it's a good it's a good thing for us to do. I think it's definitely well worth taking it that way at any rate. Any questions on that? Did we get it? I hope. Because
What was one on the far right? Again, it's absolute
impossibility. Yeah.
Extremes.
Right. Yeah. So absolutely certain or absolute probability that it happened, or a lot of people will do it more or less likely. Some people do it. I mean, there's not necessarily a rule for this. There are some. If you are a statistics major, there's some ways to come and look at probabilities of things and actually assign numbers to these things, and then that takes a lot of math, and then it usually loses a lot of people. So if you're very math inclined, then you could do more like that. And then they have a probability of 1, meaning absolute certainty, and 0.0, meaning absolutely didn't happen, right? And then everywhere in between 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 is the same thing as saying 10% likely, 20% likely, 30% likely. People kind of do different ways of thinking about it, but it's been a very long time since I took a statistics class, but what struck me most when I took it was that we do statistics in our head all day long and don't even think about it. We think about how probable something is to happen, and then we either avoid it or don't avoid it. You ever drive a motorcycle down the road, right? One of the things you're doing is you're trying to figure out the probability of something coming in your way and how you're going to avoid it and all that kind of stuff. My job at work is all risk management. My job is to determine the risk of something attacking a computer, and then what do we do to avoid that kind of stuff. And all of that is looking at a probability of how likely something is to happen. If it's more likely, I need to take action to protect it. So we use it all the time, and we don't necessarily assign numbers or things to it. Yes?
To me, it's very important that faith is defined, what faith really is. Otherwise, you can say, well, this probably happened. At least some doubt.
Right.
If we don't apply the faith definition.
Right. So a good example of this, and this is probably one of the probably the best explanation that kind of subs it up. All right. So you go out and you see this guy walking on a tightrope, and he's got a wheelbarrow and he's going across. I can say that I believe that he can do that. Right? I believe that he can do it because I just saw it, right? Now, here's where you put the trust into it, right? And this is the most important part. When are you going to get in the wheelbarrow and let him push you across? That's the trust in, right? That's the scary part. That's what you're talking about when you take that faith to I'm applying it as if I'm absolutely certain that it's going to happen, right? Even though I've never seen every time that he went across the tightrope, so I really don't know that, if I only saw him do it once, I mean, I got one sample set of him doing it, right? If I watched him 100 times and it was over the Grand Canyon or something like that, I probably still would not get in the wheelbarrow with him, even after seeing him successfully do it 100 times.
That would just make for two idiots. Best definition of faith I've ever heard is when you're walking in the dark and you get to the very end of the light, then you take one more step.
Yep, same type of thing.
Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of apologetics, when adopting this scale of certainty notion, internalizing it and saying, instead of stating things dogmatically, which frequently the church historically has done, you state things in terms of a probability. And this gives you a lot more peace because you don't have to have the head on. You can kind of put your arm around the person who doesn't know Jesus and affectionately lead him toward at least accepting that Christianity has a high probability of being true. Paul seems to indicate that this is the only way to transmit the message, because he says, and I guess his word is final, in the same book of Corinthians, I believe, first or possibly second. He says that to the Jew, I became a Jew, although he wasn't a Jew any longer, to the Greek, he became a Greek. So he was dealing with certain probabilities which would enable him to cross the gulf between the mindset of the one that was listening and his own. But not in a dogmatic and authoritative way necessarily, but in an accommodative way. You know, if we're going to extend this to the realm of agnostics or even Gnostics, which is a whole different group of people, as you've said. I don't know how many people know what the Gnostics are. How many would say you really know what a Gnostic is? Yeah, I didn't think. Okay. So anyway.
So tell us.
Well, no, I'm not, you know, but they need to know. If you're going to mention Gnostic, then tell them what it means, or ask somebody what it means, and they can explain what it means. So my point is that Paul says, hey, all we're looking for is a nice, cozy, friendly exchange, and the best thing you can do is put yourself in the moccasins of the other person, or the floppers, or whatever people are wearing these days, and you'll make some contact. You'll do a bridge over the troubled waters.
I think you make a good point, because if you're evangelizing to somebody or you're witnessing to somebody and you say something is absolutely certain, all they have to do is raise a question.
That's right.
Is this even possible? Even if Jesus being an alien from a different planet is only 1% possible, right? Now they've put doubt. Now in their mind they're saying, you cannot possibly be absolute certain because there's at least 1% chance that Jesus was an alien from another planet. Or a 2% chance that he wasn't really buried and he was just thrown out with a bunch of carcasses. Right? That's all they have to do to derail your argument if you say that there's absolute certainty to it. No, what is better and what is more accommodating to what faith is in the biblical sense is that I think that it's most likely, and I've put my trust in that. That's different, because then they realize that you're being honest, that there's not absolute certainty, and that you've gone ahead and you've taken that leap. So why, if you don't think it's absolutely certain, have you taken the leap? That's going to intrigue them. They're going to want to know why. So it's a lot different than when you're talking to them, because I talk to atheists all the time, and if you say anything in absolute terms, they will attack it, and they'll feel like they've won because they came up with a 1% possibility that it's not true. And you won't get very far with them in dealing with them. So I think that's what Don was saying there is very, very, very important for us when we're talking with other people of different faiths. Just remember that although the evidence does not give us absolute certainty, we trust in that it is true, as if it's 100% true. So maybe you think about it this way, just like his statement is, you walk in until the light's all gone and then you take the one more step, right? So the evidence leads us to here and we take the one more step, right? That's the trust in. We get in the wheelbarrow, right? Yes?
I can't help but add, because I've been reading Cold Case.
Oh yeah, excellent book.
And then the next thing is to build your case with multiple evidences, because you start here with one and they're only getting the beginning. As you add, it adds certainty to your whole argument.
Right.
Until they come to the point where, oh my goodness, that's a lot of evidence for God. And they begin to turn.
Right. Yeah, so a good...
It takes a relational.
Right. She's referencing a book. It's called Cold Case Christianity, and it's written by a guy named J. Warner Wallace, and he is a cold case homicide detective, and if you watch 60 Minutes, you've probably seen him a couple times, because there's been a couple cold cases where he's been on to solve the murder and stuff like that. But he is a Christian apologist. He's one of my professors, actually, at Biola. And I think he lives down in L.A. somewhere in that area, because that's where he still is active detective there, but he's taking on the role more of a chaplain or something like that. But he's still working on a couple of cold cases. In fact, one of them he said is going to be on TV pretty soon. He actually knows that guy that was that's always on the show, that's always interviewing him. I forget what his name is. And he's a very hardcore, committed atheist. And so he actually talks about some of the conversations they've had off the side, when the cameras aren't rolling. But really interesting. So his point is, how do you build a case in court, right? If you look at what Paul says or what Peter says in 1 Peter 3:15, he says, make your apology. Well, what does that mean? Well, apology, the Greek word, means to make a defense, like a legal defense, right? So what you believe and what you hope for, make a legal defense for that and tell it to everybody with gentleness and respect. And I think that is a good example of how you do that. How do you make that case so that you have a preponderance of evidence? So when people deny it, they know what they're denying. And I think that's what, if I'm correct, I read the book, but your impressions of it are the same.
And on that scale that you've written down, which is very helpful, from absolute certainty, absolute denial, we shouldn't approach things from either extreme. And in fact, the atheist who absolutely denies that God can exist is being impossibly stupid, and that's why truly intelligent, intellectual people never use the word atheist in the sense that is, some kind of assumption that there is literally no God. No theos, God, no God. No one would be so stupid as to say that. Why? Because you cannot demonstrate it. You cannot demonstrate. Right. Because that would indicate that you'd have to, trespass the boundaries of the universe to see if God was outside the universe. And what Christians say, well, how does a simple-minded human being with no capacities like that perform such a feat? He can't possibly get outside the universe to see if God's out there, can't traverse or trespass the boundaries of the universe. So my point is that atheism is kind of a dying breed. They will call themselves now, I don't know.
Agnostics. Yeah.
I don't know. And that's a whole other ball of wax. You're not dealing with a no. You're dealing with it probably not. So already atheism has taken a collective step, at least at the highest levels, right, to this position of agnosticism. And when they use the pet phrase that existed so long, atheism, they don't do it among their peers or their equals, their intellectual rivals and companions. They use the correct word, agnostic.
I was reading, and there's a new trend that is going on. There's this thing called the Atheist Guide to Reality, Enjoying Life Without Illusions, by this guy named Alex Rosenberg, and he's a professor of philosophy. I forgot what school he teaches at. But he's even gotten away from the agnostic part. And he says we need to be positive to say what we do believe in. And he says we should call ourselves scientists, people that believe in science, which is only science, and only science is the only way to know anything. The question is, with science, how do you determine whether or not your daughter or son loves you? Right? How with science do you determine that? Right? Even more important, which I think was a bad point in his book, my first problem with it, is if science is the only way to know truth, what scientific experiment did you do to confirm that? We call that self-refuting, right? His statement, science is the only way to know things, it cannot possibly be demonstrated because you can't use science to demonstrate that fact. That is just a belief based upon what? A predisposition. We really don't have any evidence that that's the case. They just pick it out of the air. In fact, they have evidence against that case. Like I just said, how do you know that somebody loves you? How do you prove that scientifically? Right? So,
I'm a little bit of a problem here. It may not be that big a deal, but I don't think anywhere in Paul's writings he talked about high probability or any of that sort of thing. Pretty much everything, what I read of it, and I think I read most of it, he's talking about this is a fact. And the reason I'm saying that is because I know what I know. Mm-hmm. And what I believe. But I'm afraid some people might be a little bit of doubt planted in their brain there by saying it's high probability.
But I don't think that that's unfair, because...
Well, that's why it's so important that the faith aspect be thoroughly explained.
Right. But I don't. When you say faith, just out of curiosity, how would you define faith? I mean, if you had a definition of it.
I believe, like I just said, taking that extra step after the light's gone out.
Right.
Or run out of light, or I believe it firm enough that that's the way I want to try to live my life.
We're in agreement on that, because I agree that that's the right definition. What I don't think the right definition is, faith means I have no evidence, yet I'm going to believe.
Oh, no, I think there's plenty of evidence
Right.
for faith.
So the question is, when you have evidence, all the evidence that you have, does it add up to 100% certainty?
Again, I think Paul probably did.
Well, but that betrays the definition you just gave. You said when you get to the end of the light, the end of the evidence.
Stated it as fact is what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah.
The Bible.
Oh, I would state it as fact as well. And maybe we just haven't got far enough into this,
Okay.
because the evidence that we have are facts saying that Jesus was witnessed by 500 people that were raised again. That's a fact that Paul gives in his cumulative case. He said that that Peter saw him, and I saw, and I too saw him. These are all his pieces of evidence that he's putting. He's basically calling in what eyewitness testimony, which would be the Gospels, or a transcript of someone giving the eyewitness testimony to somebody else in the case of Mark. And so that's what they're doing. I think we're on the same wavelength. I think maybe it'll become a little bit clearer as we get into it, because I think we are.
I
Yeah.
think what we want to fight against, war against in our soul is not being too dogmatic. That's the whole emphasis here. In Hebrews 11:1, where we get the definition of faith, it's an assured expectation of things not yet happened, but we just have faith they're going to happen. So that's kind of an incomplete story. As you use the illustration, when the light ceases and it's a little dark, and we take a step anyway. So that's a confession that we don't quite have all the data, and so we don't really have that kind of certainty, but we're going to do it anyway. So there's always the minus sign that has to be added to our faith, and thus we can avoid making pompous and idiotic statements like the world is going to end in 1988, and these are 88 reasons why Jesus is returning, as Weisenant said shortly before resigning and suggesting that maybe he can come back in 1992. That's been a long time. So, let's not be stupid. People laugh at stupid people, and we don't want to be stupid.
Are we saying that you say one thing, you are confident in yourself, you have the faith, but when you're dealing with the outsider,
Perfect. Nicely put. I should have thought of saying it that way. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
maybe you aren't so
We're talking about evangelism.
dogmatic because you realize they're not there, and all you've got to build this case.
Absolutely.
So you start more hypothetically in your dealing with them, and then start building that case until they come to the faith that you
That's
have.
the ideal. They come to the faith. We have faith. So
Yeah.
we share the faith, and it's not dogmatically.
Yeah, I think also I'd add on to it, the concept of probability is there, even when we say that the darkness and then the one step into the darkness, we're actually talking about a level of probability, even though Paul may have not used the word probability or statistics or anything like that. But he did, and the same thing we're going to do is we're going to say this is a fact, this is a fact, this is a fact, and this is a fact. Now put this all together, what's the probability that this is true? Well, true enough that you can take the step to go to absolute certainty. Trust in. I guess maybe that's the best way to do it. But when we talk to everybody else, if we go around saying it's absolutely certain that this happened, they're going to say, well, the evidence doesn't add up to that. So now...
Because they don't have that evidence.
Right. So we want to give them all that evidence, and we show them that this is why we trust in this, why we've taken that extra step into the darkness, so to speak. I wish that you could do that negatively, like you're taking the step into absolute light or something like that, because it would be a better metaphor. but it worked. I
Well,
don't
these people, another factor is the relational side that this hasn't come into play with at all.
Right.
because, and the example I would use would be you and Devin. When I first cowered out and said, "Here, take over," because I'm quote at my wit's end and want to strangle him, like my friend that's an atheist. Then you would talk with him. And now, how long has that been? 2 years?
2 or 3 years.
And now you have a relationship with him. He doesn't talk to you the way he once did. He now has respect for you, and you go back and forth, and his eyes are slowly, I believe, being opened. You can't push it, you can't rush it, you have to be,
Some people are a tough nut to crack. And you have to show that part, because here's the problem that he does, and I noticed, this is a friend that I didn't know. He had him on Facebook, and then he got me in on Facebook, said, "Hey, can you talk to this guy?" And now we've been going back and forth for a long time. And he was very rude to anything any Christian ever said anything. He would just jump all over you and say, "You're an idiot, stupid, you can't believe in that stuff." And then through us having conversations, me using gentleness and respect and just being patient with him, a level of patience that is obviously from the Holy Spirit. Through that part, we're now to the point where friends. He's going to come up and we're going to go watch Star Wars together because he lives in Arizona, so he's not like around the block. So he's willing to take a drive out here to go see Star Wars with me and some other people. So in December, so that's a big deal that we've gone from him just calling us all names to the point that he at least respects us. But the thing that he always continues to do is he always posts news articles about Christians who say dumb things, or rude things, or hurtful things, or whatever. A good example is he posted one about a pastor who refused to do, the day before, a funeral for someone who was turned out to be homosexual. So the day before, he denied doing it, which I think that's kind of insensitive. That's kind of against what a pastor's supposed to be. You don't have to agree with the lifestyle. The guy's dead. He's not sinning anymore. Judgment has happened. So it's for the family. And how does the family interpret you kicking them out? Right. Especially when the mother was a member of the church and had been baptized there and had been there her whole entire life. So he posts stories like that just to see what I'm going to say about it.
Right.
Because he wants to see, do you guys really care, or are you guys really just a bunch of hate mongers? Because that's what he wants to do. So that level of dealing with somebody over a long period of time, you have to make your case, like she said, but there's also this human aspect that you have to deal with, the relationship with it, that can be hard. Because there's a Muslim guy I talked to at the gym. We haven't got to this point yet that we can talk about the resurrection and like what does that mean and what does it not, because I only get like 5 minutes a week with him, so I haven't got to that point yet. But you eventually get to that point, and if I don't get to that point, somebody else will, right? But he's going to see that all Christians aren't all, because one of the things that he was concerned about why he doesn't like to talk about religion is because he says all Christians assume that we're all terrorists. He at least confided in me that that's how he felt, and I said, well, I don't believe that. I mean, that would be idiotic to say all Muslims are terrorists. I know plenty of Muslims that aren't, and I know plenty of Muslims that do speak out against it. So I don't consider you a terrorist just because you're a Muslim. And so
at the gym or online?
This guy's at the gym. Yeah. So I got some friends at the gym that I see every once in a while. I got a Mormon, I got a Jehovah's Witness, I got a pagan. So you don't realize all these people are in your life, and most of the time when you go to the gym, everybody's talking about sports, right? And so there's not a whole lot of talk, but they know that I don't talk about sports because I say, well, I'm not really interested and I don't really care. So that opens the door for me to talk about something else. Well, what are you into? I just graduated. Well, what'd you graduate in? I got my thing in Christian apologetics. What is apologetics? You go through that whole entire thing. It gives you an opportunity to talk to them about something other than sports. Because what they want to do is they want to go there and they want to have a basically no-depth relationship. We'll just talk about whatever sports thing happened. You give your opinion, I'll give you my opinion. And then there's no commitment or no level into it. And I'm there and I'm talking about, like things like, ethical business practices and stuff like that. And, well, how did that make you feel and all this kind of stuff. It's building a relationship deeper than just, how the Warriors do. You know what I mean? So there's a lot to it. And part of it's making the case and part of it's being their friend. right? And not kicking them out. One of the things that I think when I was talking to a lady, telling her about one of the classes that we were having here, and I was out in front, and she says, and in my way of talking to her, I said, what if you have an atheist and you're talking to him and you say that you believe in the resurrection, and he says, no, I don't believe in that mythological stuff. What would you say next? And she said, oh no, I don't have any friends that are atheists, and I don't want any. And I'm like, well, how are you going to evangelize to people? Her whole point was you should only associate with Christians. Well, Jesus didn't do that. Jesus went to the prostitutes and to the tax collectors, to all the bad people. He went and became friends with them. That's what he did. So I think that you kind of miss the whole evangelism thing if you just say, well, I'm only going to talk to Christians.
Yeah, Paul Johnson, the historian who's written an excellent book on the history of Christianity, he used the phrase, it's kind of trite and well known, but 1,000 years ago, everybody believed in God and didn't have a clue why. Now, in the contemporary world, everybody doesn't believe in God but doesn't have a clue why. So we're dealing with ignorance in both cases, so that would give educated, informed, well-meaning Christians a great opportunity to talk about the God that the masses disbelieve in. They can do the Acts 17 thing that Paul did, and that was dealing with probability. Men of Athens, I behold, you are very religious. Why? You got all these idols all over town. Let me tell you about Jesus. So, lots of bridges. And since no one knows why they're atheists or agnostics, tell them why, and then refute it.
Yeah, it's a good thing, too, if you're talking to people. So far, in what we've talked about, if you have to say why the resurrection is so important, what would you say? What would you say is the reason why the resurrection is so important? Because remember, you might run into somebody and they say, you Christians are always talking about this, especially around Easter, because they'll see the little Newsweek thing in the stand, and they'll say, why is this so important to you? What are you going to say? Why is it important?
I think it's important because it provides the benefit that you will receive as a result of the resurrection. Each individual believer will receive the same benefit of that resurrection of Jesus, and that is everlasting life.
Right.
In the presence of God.
Right.
But it's physical proof, physical evidence
Right.
of what he said is proof, and that it's a stepping stone to more.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it too. Both ways are great. I like that one too, because what you're honing in on, you're honing on properly in on the idea that this is evidence of what will happen to us, our hope for the future, and you're honing in on the thing. Well, compared to Islam, how would I prove that Muhammad didn't actually have the angel of Gabriel come down and tell him all this stuff, the Quran? I have no way of proving that or disproving it, right? There's nothing I can do about it. Christianity, Paul says, hey, if this is false, and you can show it to be false, then Christianity is not true. So every other religion doesn't have anything like that, where you could prove it to be false. Well, other than some of the cults that have said the end of the world's going to happen on this day. Well, that's provable false, and it happens from time to time. But I'm talking about the main religions, like you've talked about Buddhism, Eastern mysticism, Islam, and the other religions that are out there. If you look at it that way, Christianity has the way that you can be falsified. The other ones don't. You can't falsify Buddhism, because Buddhism has an answer for everything. Why is pain and suffering happen to you now? Well, because you did something wrong. But I haven't done anything wrong. Well, it must have been in a past life. How do you prove that? There's no way to prove what you did in your past life to know why this bad stuff is happening to you. This is interesting too, and keying in on what this gentleman said here earlier about our future truth. It just hit me when he said it. You get a lot of preachers out there that say God wants you to be wealthy, He wants you to be healthy, He wants all these great things for you, right? But what did Jesus say? He gave us one guarantee: in this life you will have trouble, right? So how do you reconcile that with Jesus wants me to be rich? Jesus wants me to be healthy. Jesus wants me to be all this stuff. Resurrection answers all of that. That riches and that health and all of that stuff isn't guaranteed in this life. It's guaranteed in the next. Right? So that's the other thing that I think some people will get sucked up into it. It seems to be a very American-centric thing, because you don't go to Zimbabwe and talk to the Christians there and preach the gospel of wealth to them because they'll run you out of town. But thinking about that, see, we're applying the resurrection to that same type of instance we're talking about here, looking towards that future thing. Isn't it adequate to just hold that Jesus was a great teacher? Because a lot of people will say that. Jesus was a great teacher. Muslims will say that he was a prophet, which is better than even being a great teacher. He's like, he's up there. But this is what atheists will say. He was a great teacher. He taught us a lot of good things moral. Well, what would you say back to him about something like that?
Well, I wouldn't respond to it necessarily, but it's not adequate because he was much more than a great teacher. Everything in that Paul tells us about Jesus and his purpose for being here, all the prophecies that were fulfilled, all indicate that he may have been a great teacher, but that's not why he came.
Right.
That wasn't his purpose to be here. So that's not enough.
I hope this is an introduction to C.S. Lewis's approach.
Yes.
Okay. Does everyone know what C.S. Lewis would say in a case like that if you read Mere Christianity?
No, I don't.
Well,
Been a while.
Go ahead, Don. You got the floor. You open your mouth.
yes. I think you know. Am I right? Yeah, he knows, but he's not saying. I think we should force Don. Don 1, Don 2, Don 3.
Shift the burden to me.
But, see, what I think these happen among Christians is they have to participate in the discussion. Someone uses a term you don't understand, stop them. Don't let them roll on. What do you mean by Gnosticism? What do you mean by resurrection? It's that we haven't even defined the term yet. And I would lay money that if we use that as a homework assignment and ask the folks to find out of their own background and knowledge just what the resurrection is and how it should be defined, we'd have a nice little interesting discussion of why A disagrees with B and C and D have their own ideas, and so does F.
You sure A would agree?
I'm not
with you?
so sure about that. I'm saying we're going to have a real chaotic discussion. So, yeah, I would like to have that on the table as what is the resurrection that we've seen that is central. We've been asking all kinds of things about it, but it's as of yet an undefined term. And I know at least one person has suggested that it's something that it isn't. Okay, so that said, I'll leave that question there. Do you want to hear about what C.S. Lewis would say to the question specifically, I don't believe that Jesus, or I believe that Jesus was, it's an affirmative, a teacher. And golly,
Go ahead.
These people really, I always divide human beings into two groups, the readers and the non-readers. The reason I read so much is because I'm so ignorant. Okay? I am very ignorant. And I'm very genuinely truthful about that. And that's why I read. Why? Because if you read and think and study, you can overcome, to some degree, ignorance, which is the story of life, or should be. C.S. Lewis, in his wisdom, 40 or 50 years ago, said that Jesus, if he is a good teacher, and the agnostic has made this confession, there are only three choices of just exactly who he is as a good teacher. He's either a liar, or a lunatic, or the Lord himself. So you ask the agnostic, was Jesus a liar? Well, no, he was a truthful fellow. My goodness, he died for his convictions. Well, one of his convictions was he and the Father were somehow one, and that he was deity, he was God. That's what the Christian church confesses and has for almost 2,000 years. Was Jesus a liar, therefore, or was he the Son of God? Well, he must have been deceived. Well, then, was he a good teacher? If he deceives people, is that what a good teacher is? So they're hooked on the horns of a three-pronged dilemma, trilemma they call them, if you want to be specific. The other reason was he was a lunatic. Maybe he was just crazy and spouting off imbecilic things, and he was just, certifiable, as they say. Is that what you believe about this good teacher, Mr. Agnostic? Is that what you believe? That this good teacher that you said was a good teacher lied about his deity, being God? Did he, or was he simply balmy? Was he titched? Was he off his rocker? Was he nuts? Was he still a good teacher? Well, being either a liar or insane? Well, the only option would seem to be, and I'm not using my own thought here, I'm just copying C.S. Lewis, who was brighter than all of us at these tables put together, and he's offering this stuff in a little book about 100 pages, and you could memorize this stuff in 5 minutes. You'd read the book, which should take you 45 minutes. So, the agnostic no longer can say Jesus is a great teacher. He must either say that Jesus was a liar, lied about his being, his status before God, or he was just nuts. Had the God dilemma. They call that, what do they call it? Not theocracy, not theodicy, but narcissism to the extremes. Thank you very much. Or, if those two are not acceptable to you as a thinking Gnostic, Mr. Agnostic, then you must accept him as Lord. If he was neither a liar nor a lunatic, and he said what he said, he must have been the Lord indeed, and your Lord too. You want to accept him now? Give me 5 more minutes.
And when you ask that trilemma question, you get to experience the height of evasiveness.
Go for it. Chase him down. Chase him down. No, but see, that's why I don't understand why Christians don't avail themselves of all that stuff that we've got. I don't understand it.
Well, it's a good thing, because I think what C.S. Lewis is pointing out here, which Don has laid out completely for us, is that when someone says that he's a great teacher, they really don't have that option, because they really don't know what he said. So how could you say someone's a great teacher if you don't know what he said? It's absolutely a cop-out.
What do you mean?
As C.S. Lewis has said, it was patronizing nonsense. So what you end up with is, okay, we have this thing. Either he is God or he's not God. And if he's not God, he's either lying or he thinks he's telling the truth, but he's not, and he's a lunatic. We don't have any other choices. Yeah.
Well, in making the statement that he was a great teacher, that's relegating Jesus to being only a man.
Correct.
And that's all. So
Very limiting.
that's not enough.
Yeah.
Because you're limiting God himself.
And if you think he's a great teacher, you think he's probably still in the tomb, right?
Yeah, and that he had no opportunity for resurrection in any fashion, because
Right.
he's just like you and me.
Right.
So they're negating the whole resurrection process. In fact, all the questions here relate to resurrection, and they don't relate to, that's the context of the question is it adequate to hold that Jesus was a great teacher and that's all? In other words, there was no resurrection, he was not
Right.
Taken up, so on and so forth. So that, I think C.S. Lewis and I agree.
Well said.
Oh, I do too, but he had a real serious, concrete argument as to you only have 3 choices. So he narrows it down to a forced conclusion that Jesus was Lord rather than a lunatic or a liar. Come back again.
Have a good day. So were you going to say something?
Well, it's over 50 years old, because we remember studying it when we were in high school.
Really? Well, see, I didn't study until I was out of Watchtower Society, so that was about 30.
Long
Yeah,
time.
it is over 50 years, isn't it?
Time flies when you're having fun.
A couple.
But, I mean, just when somebody says he's a great teacher, then just bringing up, I'm the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father by me. Now, if he's a good teachers don't lie.
Mhm. That's the point.
Bring us back,
That's the point, yeah.
to that. Is he a lunatic? Was he just crazy? Well, then he can't be a good teacher if he's, But it's when you don't know somebody, that's the, like you're saying, Don, the mastery of evasiveness comes out. And it's very difficult. When you have a relationship, that means you got to spend time getting to know these people and having friends that aren't Christians. You have to be willing to do that, which takes energy and work. Not, oh, you're Jehovah's Witness, I don't have time to talk to you today. Goodbye. Which is the easy thing to do. You're busy. You've got a lot of things going on, but that's it. We have to change our priority set on what's important.
Yeah, one of my family members, Jehovah's Witnesses, came to the door and they said, "We already have Jesus," and closed the door in their face. I thought, well, that's
Beautiful.
not the appropriate approach. That makes them feel like they're a martyr, and we kind of lost an opportunity. Jesus says, as you're going, make disciples. And it seems to be that if they come to your door, that's a lot easier than you going out and finding them. Now, if you ever do talk to Jehovah's Witnesses, please talk to this man before you do. He can help you out with it, because they are very masterful in twisting Scripture. So, just so you know, it's going to...
And if you really don't want to ever have them come back, you arrange for him to be there when they come back.
Just use my name.
He's on the blacklist.
Right. So just really quickly before we end, one last question. And I think this is really kind of important when we look at this, and it's important for us to be honest with it, and that's, do we have biases when we look at stuff? When we look at any evidence, do we have bias?
Yeah.
It's important, though, that when we talk with other people, we admit to what our biases are, because just to clear the air in that relational thing, just being honest with them, saying, well, yeah, maybe I was raised Christian, but I've looked at the evidence and I still hold to that to this day. So maybe I have a bias towards it, but, I mean, you have a bias against it, so.
Well, he's amazed at Christians that don't spew hate. He doesn't understand that at all. That to him, that's an oxymoron.
Right.
That he does not. Yeah, definitely. Because that's not a Christian. What? And that's when he's really interested in trying to push your buttons, testing constantly. Because are you really this way, or is this just a front that you're putting up?
Right.
And that's just it. That now we're talking about time, because he was originally hurt a long time ago, which many of these people have been hurt by the Christian world in one way or another many years ago, and they never want to go back. I'll do anything, come up with any other answer to this rather than God.
A really good book that I'm in the middle of reading right now, it's Nancy Pearcey. She wrote 2 books, Finding Truth, which is the second book of the 2, and then Total Truth is the first book. It's really good talking about different worldviews and how Christians deal with it, but in a couple of the chapters, she tells a little bit about her story, about how she was grown up in a Lutheran home. She went to Lutheran day school when she was a kid, and I kind of have an affinity with it because I was in that same boat, right? But that she kind of, in the 60s, got away from that. One of the reasons is she was asking tough questions of Christians, and they gave her no answers. They basically told her, oh, you just don't have enough faith. And she's like, it has nothing to do with faith. I know that if Jesus Christ does exist, that I've done everything I need to do to be saved. That's what she said. But that's not my question. My question is, does God exist? She had a more fundamental-based question. But her pastor just kind of like blew her off and said, well, you just don't have enough faith.
Go read your Bible.
Yeah, something along those lines. Instead of, how can I help you with what is truly your question? Let's find out what your question is, and then let's look at it. There's all kinds of evidence that God exists from a general point of view. There's whole libraries full of it. And some of you have seen my library, so you know that there's a lot of stuff out there. And the question is, when someone has those questions, what do you do? If you don't answer it, and then you send them off to a secular college, for professors who profess to eat Christians for lunch, what do you expect? When you put them out there, you got to inoculate them, before you put them out there. Otherwise, they're going to deal with all these other worldviews, and they're going to be like, I don't know, I don't have the tools to deal with comparing those to see which one lines up with reality versus not. You know what I mean? If they don't have those tools, when they get put into college, they're going to believe that resurrection is a myth. Now, I had someone tell me this too, because in again, this book here, N.T. Wright's book, he talks about a lot of like the Mithras and other things that atheists will always point out. Well, Mithras was resurrected, and Osiris was resurrected, or whatever. And so this is just Jesus. They just applied this to Jesus. First of all, their concept of resurrection is completely different. One, which he brought up, and probably is good homework. So that'll be your homework. Go look up the resurrection. Come back with a good definition. But their concept was completely different. So how do you deal with that type of thing when you talk about that, right? So they're talking about something that's completely different than what we're talking about. So we got to make sure we're on the same page as well when we're talking about these things. So I think we're out of time, right? Dear Heavenly Father, we want to thank you today for our earthly fathers on this Father's Day, and thank them for their job in raising us and our families that you've put us in. We want to thank you for our class today, and you for being our Heavenly Father and sending your Son not only to die for us, but to rise again so that we may be restored to our relationship with you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.